thank you for sitting down with me today. This is in the series of interviews you're doing with your children, and each interview is a different aspect of your life. What I've asked you to talk about today is your childhood, your parents, and your grandparents, so that your children and your children's children and on through the generations will have a record of who those people were and who you were as a boy.
Okay.
That became the man. And so if you would bear with me, I'd like to start with your mother's side of the family and then to your father's and then to your childhood. So tell me, if you would, about your mother's parents. Where did they come from, what their names were, what they enjoyed doing?
Okay. Well, they're from known one. I had a stroke, but I will do my best. They were from district of Nordland in Norway, so they came over to Ellis Island about 1860s. So at that time, the open borders, so anybody could come. So they take to Ellis Island and took a train to Minneapolis, and then they have to walk up to Griglap where their homestead was. And my mother was a young girl, about 8 years old when they arrived. So they stayed in Minneapolis for a little while. He was a bartender. They homesteaded in Grigla and raised, they built a house, a little house, and they raised 8 children. So they were all farmers and stocks. So they were ambitious and they spread all around the country.
And what were your mother's parents' first names?
Yeah, my grandmother was Jorland. I think Jorland, Jorland, and my grandfather was Sigurd. I never met him, but I remember my grandmother. She was an elderly lady and bombacine, a black dress, and she smoked a pipe.
So they worked hard and they raised 8 kids, did you say?
Yeah.
And your mother, Tony, was one of the younger ones?
She was about in the middle, but she was more ambitious, and she went to the 8th grade. She was very literate, and she got a job as a teenager working with a local doctor, and she was a nurse, and she rode around in a horse and buggy, and they delivered babies and made house calls.
And later, did she continue to be a midwife through her life?
Because home delivery was very common in those days. When I was, all our 6 kids were born at home.
Mm-hmm. And so what did Tony, your mother, like to do? What was her pleasure in life?
Well, she was a wonderful wife and mother. She did all the housework and cooking and even helped milk our cows and all that. So she was a very ambitious, good lady. I honor her. She was a saint.
And did she ever get together with her women friends at your house for quinniferatings?
Yeah, they both were. My father and mother were very sociable. We had card games in our house. We played rummy and whist, mostly whist, and some pinochle. But Dad was big and strong and outspoken, and he just loved company. I liked to laugh, and he was very outgoing. Mother was more of a serving person, a little mouse. She was a perfect mother, so gentle. I never heard her say a word out of line, and they never hit me or I did service sometimes, but they were very gentle with people.
Very good. So tell us about your father's side of the family. What were his parents' names and where were they from?
They were from Sweden. They came a little later. They came in about 1890s, and their names were Ida and Aaron. And I think they met on the ship coming over, and they got married. They got a homestead up in Gregla, so they had to walk or ride a wagon up to Gregla.
How far is it from Minneapolis to Grigla?
About 250 miles. So there was a lot of some of the last land to be homesteaded. We got 160 acres right right beside the Indian reservation. Mm-hmm. So Dad later, when he came along, he brought another 100 acres or two because he had 400 acres altogether right next to the Indian reservation.
Mm-hmm. And were both your father's parents from Dalmas, Sweden?
As far as I know.
Mm-hmm.
But they were more well-to-do family. So when my grandmother, I remember, I have the story, she wrote back to Sweden and persuaded her two brothers to come to Minnesota to build our house. So they built a wonderful house out of a very special wood, a nice two-story house. We had the nicest house in the area because of the Swedes. They built the house and dug the basement for full basement and dug the wells and built a big barn and all the outbuildings. And then they went back to Sweden.
They just came to build the house and the barn for their sister.
Yeah, they were there a few years, but they were very good builders. But they went back to Sweden after they get the farm. But Ida was a very outspoken lady. She persuaded them to build her a nice house.
And what kinds of things did Ida and Aaron enjoy doing?
Ida was an organizer, and she started the first creamery in Grigla, and we had the #1 cream can.
So it was a co-op?
Yeah, it was the whole community was a co-op. When my father died, I inherited stock from a farmer's grocery store and the filling station and the telephone company is all a co-op. They were socialized country. They brought their socialism with them. So they was a whole community already owned.
So they were socialists and they were very, very involved in the community.
Yeah, and my grandfather was an author. He wrote pamphlets on agrarian reform. I remember going up to our attic as a young boy, the whole box of his pamphlets. So, and he wrote a religious pamphlet, and then this world, that's Angel's world. He was a Swedenborgian.
So he was a Swedenborgian. They all went to the Lutheran church, but he had radical ideas for his time.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
And he believed in angels, and they were involved in his life.
He was a gentleman. I never met him, but my mother said it was an argument. He always took her side. She loved him.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
And so tell me about your father. You told me a little bit about your mother, Tony, and what she did. Tell us about your father.
Well, he was a big Swede like you are. So he was very strong and outspoken, and so he was a community leader. He's president on the school board and very active in local politics. So he was a leader and a strong man, but he was educated too. He went to the third grade because he learned to read and write, and he became a very good reader. So he would read in English and Swedish. We were subscribed to the Svenska Amerikanska Posten. So he read aloud to me sometimes, but I never learned the language, but they both spoke their native language, and I learned a few phrases. I can only understand what they're saying.
Very good. And so your parents or your household was different from a lot of households in that people read and enjoyed literature, and that was part of your family tradition then.
It was because when these men came over from Sweden, we had a special library upstairs. So when I was a kid, we had a bookshelf of books, and I used to sneak up there as soon as my sister taught me to read. But after 6 or 7 or 8, I spent a lot of time in the library upstairs.
Your father enjoyed reading. He enjoyed reading the Swedish newspapers as well as the English newspapers.
Yeah.
And did your family talk about literature? Did they talk about the news? Did they talk about current events?
No, Dad, my mother did ever doing to drive. She was more mild and homemaker, but my dad used to hold court in the middle of town. He was defending socialism and agrarian reform, so he was very outspoken in his field. He knew the answers, but I was proud of him because all the men and women respected him and listened to him.
And it wasn't just because he was bigger and stronger than everybody else.
He was an imposing man. When we had farm crews, so coming around to thrashing and cutting and splitting wood. So for recreation, my dad challenged anybody to wrestle him.
And so he loved to wrestle.
You bet.
And so you saw him many times wrestling with other men.
He never hit anybody. He's a gentleman. He never hit us. But he liked to fight because we do what we are good at.
Now, you played other games in your house because your father liked playing other games too. What other games did you play around the house?
Well, my father liked to play volleyball, so we had volleyball standards, and every time company came, he would want to play volleyball. My mother was not athletic, but so we did a lot of indoor games because it was snow so much of the year, but we're a working family we have a dairy farm and crops and so we worked a lot, but we had a big garden. Big, I don't know how much, but I know when I was a kid, I worked in that garden a lot. It was very important because we raised hogs and cattle and sheep, and so we had all of our own meat and our own vegetables. So we were pretty self-sustaining. When I was growing up in 1928, the depression was hit many families. So we didn't feel it much because we had all meat and vegetables, and so we survived very nicely. But there are so many poor people in the area. So mother had always had a housekeeper, a cook to help her, and dad had. Man, I think he paid them $1 a day sometimes. So we had two men living in our granary. They had bunk beds, and so that when I was a kid, that's where I learned to smoke. I steal their cigarettes. So anyway, we're very hospitable. They're not bums. They're needy men and women, so they were welcome to our place, and we had a big household. I remember so many people that came there, like we treated my family.
And so how many people? You had how many brothers and sisters?
Well, there were 8 of us altogether, but two died young.
Right.
My brother was still a twin and stillborn, and my oldest brother died from some
Pneumonia.
yeah, like that. So there was, rest 6 of us, but my older brother was 12 years older than I was, so he wasn't around much. When that war was on, he left over, so I never lived with him. Mm-hmm. And my sister was 10 years older than I was, and she was gone, so most of the time it was just the 4 of us.
And then your hired help, so you often had 10, 12 people around the dinner table.
You bet, yeah.
And what kind of food did you have to buy? Oh. You grew up a lot of your own food, but did you get dried fish or salted fish?
Salt and pepper, and Dad loved fish, so we got codfish and all kinds of fish. When the creek was running in the spring, we had bullheads, and Dad took us to the nearest river to catch pickerel and perch and crawfish and all that. So we had fish whenever we could, but my dad liked cheese, and so my mother or grandmother made
Premos.
Yeah, that is linked from fresh milk from a cow.
Colostrum cheese.
Right, yeah.
And, but he also liked Limburger-like cheeses.
Well, you had to eat it outside. It was too strong and smelly, but he loved it, and he got in little tins, and he ate outside.
So, your father was a hard-working man, and you not only had a dairy and granaries and a barn, he also had a blacksmith shop, didn't he?
Yeah, he can make anything. Once thing broke, he didn't go down to the hardware store. He made it if he could. So he's an old man. He's very ambitious and competent. And I remember we built a well house and fresh water that we cooled our milk. Our milk, as soon as we milk, we separated and cooled the buttermilk in the water, cool water. That's where our main steady source of income. So we had buttermilk sold to the creamery, so we had a source of income all the time.
Mm-hmm. Now you had a tractor when you were growing up. Your folks were fairly affluent, so you had tractors. But your father really preferred plowing with his horses, didn't he?
We had huge horses, about 15 or 1800 pound horses. Now saddle horse is about 800 to 900 pounds, but we had big plow horses. So Dad was very good with plow horses. And one year was a big event in the community, but a horse had tripas, so very rare. Well, two of them survived. So that I learned to ride on the plower horses. That came near dying one time. I rode a 2 or 3 year old plow horse, and I fell off. I didn't have any saddle. I fell off, and I remember looking up to see that hoofs. I could have died, but horses don't like to step on people, so they avoided me. But that was my closest encounter with death when I was a kid.
So the tractors are wonderful things. Farmers are glad to have tractors. But were there places that the horses, and times that the horses could draw a plow where a tractor couldn't?
Really bad, because the farmers tried to get in early with the ground was thawing. I remember seeing tractors stop on in the field, but the horses you can use any time. So one adventure that with horse, and during the winter, Dad had built a stone boat to pick up stones, and the horse pulling a stone wall, and my brother will take me out and on skunks, a mountain of steam coming up. So one year, I was with my older brother, so I must have been just 8 or 9 years old. So they found a mound, so they cleared the snow and started digging. They took 19 skunks out of that hydro basin, but my brother would reach in and pull them out, and my other brother would shoot them with a .22. But that was our main source of cash crop. So
for you boys.
Yeah, we took the skunks and home and skinned them and sold the pelts. So I did that for weasels and mink and a few fox. So that was a cash crop.
Sure. And so when you were a boy, you had your brothers and sisters around, but it was a ways to the nearest farm. Each farm was half mile or a mile apart.
Mile.
So did you run over to the other kids' places and play with the other kids?
I had a little neighbor. His name was Winton. So he was my buddy. We went to go together and hunted and hiked together. One time where we had log piles. There were marbles in the rock piles, like a big gopher. So, but beaver size. So we were digging around and trying to get that marmot. We got, I think we got $2 for it, so it's a prize. But we couldn't get them. So my little buddy and I decided to smoke them out, and we built a fire. And I wake up sometimes with fear because the fire got out of control. We took our jackets off and beat the fire. It was a very tense situation. We never got the marmots.
Never got the marmots, but the farm didn't burn down.
Yeah, but it's a close call.
So how far was it from where you lived to the elementary school you went to as a child?
Well, it was about 1.5 miles. It's in the country, so there kids from all around the area would walk to that school. But from 10 to 20 kids. So when I graduated from grade school, there were 2 of us. I was the best student in the 8th grade.
The 2 of you. So in the summer, you could all walk to school, but what about the winter when the snow was
Well-
deep? How did you get to school?
Well, Dad bought an old nag, so for a while all three of us, two sisters and myself, we all got on that old nag. We ran to school and turned the horse loose. But in the winter time, that was an adventure. My dad was a builder. He built a chariot, so he about 4 or 5 feet wide, maybe 6 feet long, a box and runners, and he put hay in a straw in the back, and we bundled up, and we sat down there, and he rode the chariot.
He hitched up one of the plow horses?
Yeah, and we rode in cross country. That was a big adventure because we're like the medieval times to ride a chariot. My dad was a big cap and full blisters, and he was so proud of his horse and construction and his family.
So it might have been called a one-horse open sleigh as well.
Yeah.
You always had to work. You were a farm family, you always had to work. What was the first chores that you did as a small boy?
Sure the Latin and sure the way. That means carry water and carry wood. So I was a little fast kid, so I ran errands a lot. I took my dad's lunch out to the field, so, but when I was younger, so I would carry in the wood and split wood. So I was a helper, but I didn't like the summer chores because my mother used to pick berries all over. So I had to pick berries for it. It's so boring. We picked blueberries and currants and cranberries. We had high bush cranberries all in our farm grove and nuts. So I picked the berries and nuts. So my buddy Ray and I decided to join the Marines. So we don't want to get an education. So we went into the Marines to get a GI Bill.
And you did, and you got your master's degree eventually, and you taught for many years. Dad, thank you very much for talking with us and sharing stories about your family and your childhood. Thank you again.
It's my pleasure.